Good evening, and welcome to the 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team's Wreath Laying Ceremony in honor of the fateful charge 150 years ago today on the battlefield of Gettysburg. The 1st Brigade Combat Team, and notably the 2nd Battalion, 135th Infantry, trace their lineage back to the 1st Minnesota. We honor the service and sacrifice of these very early citizen soldiers, whose bravery and gallant actions had a significant impact on the outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg and quite possibly on the Civil War itself. I am Lieutenant Colonel Simon Schaefer, the battalion commander of the 2nd Battalion, 135th Infantry, headquartered in Mankato. I've also served as a company commander within the battalion and deployed in support of Operation Enduring Freedom in 2004. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the entrance of the official party. Before we begin, it is my distinct privilege to introduce our official party. Commander of the 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team, Colonel John Jensen. The chaplain of the 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team, Major Buddy Wynn. We would like to thank our guests for joining us today for this honorable and solemn event. Many of you have served within the Minnesota Army National Guard and the 1st Brigade Combat Team and 135th Infantry. We want to thank you for your service. Also, a special recognition to the members of the community of Cannon Falls. Thank you for allowing us to be here today, and we thank you for your support of our servicemen and women and for maintaining this historic monument. The soldiers you see here today represent 150 years of history and the brave men and women that continue to answer the call of duty to military service. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing as we now honor America with the presentation of the colors and for the invocation. The invocation will be delivered by Chaplain Wynn.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to invite you on this special occasion to join me in prayer. Gracious God of justice and mercy, as we gather to honor a solemn occasion in the service of an honorable and brave force, your presence is requested and welcome so that we may know freedom. As we stand before you tonight, we are grateful for a hushed battlefield. We offer our thanks for the freedoms we enjoy, and for those still serving, we accept our responsibility to defend that freedom. Pray tonight, Lord, that we not imagine that the mere hearing of a prayer on occasions such as this will suffice to achieve the righteousness that exalts a nation. Inspire each one of us here to see you and to find you in daily private conversation. Make us collectively aware of what we can accomplish together as a people who believe that unless the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. As we remember the brave Minnesotans and all those who violently pursued peace and those who suffered and their families, we pray as President Lincoln did, whose words ring true nearly 150 years later, that we, in your favor as the author of life, may finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow, and for his orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. We ask these things in your holy and almighty name. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain Wynn. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Welcome again to this evening's ceremony. We thank you for taking time on this very special day to remember the service of the 1st Minnesota and all of our fallen service members that have fought and died in service to our state and nation. Congressman Tim Walz represents the 1st District of Minnesota, which spans across southern Minnesota. He has always been a strong supporter of the military and is a 24-year veteran. Representative Walz could not join us today, but sends his regards and has provided a letter for this evening's ceremony. From the office of Timothy Walz, Congress of the United States, 1st District, Minnesota, to the commander and soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 135th Infantry, 34th Division. This year, our nation commemorates the 150th anniversary of the heroic charge of the brave men of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The Battle of Gettysburg is the Civil War's most famous battle, and it was Minnesotans who helped secure the strategic location on Cemetery Ridge that allowed for an eventual Union victory. These men also fought valiantly in other significant battles of the Civil War, including the Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Antietam, and the Bristow and Mine Run campaigns. President Calvin Coolidge would later remark that so far as human judgment can determine, Colonel Colvill and those 8 companies of the 1st Minnesota are entitled to rank as the saviors of their country. The sacrifices of the 1st Minnesota will never be forgotten, because Minnesotans take great pride in their legacy, and it endures through the service of the Minnesota Army National Guard. The soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 135th Infantry, and their repeated service through wartime pay tribute to those who came before them as they continue to stand guard on the shoulders of giants. Sincerely, Tim Walz, Member of Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce the 1st Brigade Commander, Colonel John Jensen. Colonel Jensen is also serves in a full-time capacity as the Minnesota National Guard Joint Force Headquarters Chief of Staff. He has served in various assignments at the battalion, brigade, division, and state headquarters level with the Iowa Army National Guard and the Minnesota National Guard. Colonel Jensen has completed tours of duty in Kuwait and Bosnia. In 2007, he deployed in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom as 1st Brigade's headquarters forward commander. In 2009, he returned to Iraq, this time serving as the 34th Infantry Division's Assistant Chief of Staff and Operations Director, while the division was headquartered at Contingency Operating Base in Basra, Iraq. In 2010, Colonel Jensen was assigned as 34th Infantry Division's Chief of Staff. In total, he has served more than 29 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel John Jensen.
Thank you, Simon. Good evening, everyone. You know, about 85 years ago this month, the monument before you was dedicated, and President Calvin Coolidge came and spoke in honor of Colonel Colvill in the 1st Minnesota. Well, today you get me. Not the president, but I am very honored to be here as we pause on the eve of Independence Day to remember the service and sacrifice of a small group of men who 150 years ago participated in a historical event so monumental that we can't help but to gather and pause in honor, in respect, and internal gratitude. We thank Congressman Walz for his letter. We also thank the city of Cannon Falls, Mayor Robinson, and the city council for their support of tonight's event. And we welcome all the former and current members of the Minnesota Army National Guard with a specific focus on former Command Sergeant Majors of the regiment and commanders of the regiment. Also like to say thank you, Major General Lang, for attending this evening. Brigadier General Cahill, thank you for attending this evening. Command Sergeant Major Kohlberg, the soldiers to the 135 Infantry, the 3rd Minnesota Infantry Company C, our gentlemen and our ladies who are wearing appropriate attire. I'd also like to welcome and thank Eric Kurska. Interesting enough, about 11 months ago, maybe 12 months ago, Eric and I were involved in conducting transfer of authority of the 1st Brigade, and he and I met for lunch just south of Cannon Falls on the highway. And I asked him, I said, Eric, you know, have you ever been to Colonel Colvill's monument? You know, that's something I've always wanted to do, but I've never been there. He said, no, I haven't. I said, hey, I'm on my way back to the Twin Cities. Why don't you come up here with me? And so he and I did. We drove up, we walked, and we started looking around. And Eric and I, you know, we had to take our shoes off because we, you know, didn't, you know, we'd kind of do math a little slow. And so with our fingers and toes, we figured out, holy smokes, next year is going to be 150 years. we should do something to honor the men of this regiment. And that afternoon, Eric, was, this is the end of that afternoon's thought. So interesting enough, there was no beer involved in that. That was strictly done off of iced tea and a couple cheeseburgers, I think. An interesting side note, almost simultaneous with our ceremony tonight, Major General Rick Nash, the Adjutant General of Minnesota, is meeting Major General Perry Smith, the Adjutant General of Alabama, on the very spot our Minnesota men met General Wilcox's Alabama Brigade. Now, we've warned General Nash to take it easy on General Smith this time. We don't need to add Alabama to the list of southern states that aren't happy with us or the state of Minnesota. In April 1861, they came. 100 men to a company, 10 companies to a regiment. They came because their governor, Alexander Ramsey, had promised President Lincoln that he would contribute a full regiment to the services of the United States. 1,000 men strong from the militia units in St. Paul, Stillwater, Minneapolis, St. Anthony, Red Wing, Faribault, Hastings, Wabasha, Winona, and other small towns, villages, and farms from across eastern Minnesota. April 1861, and the 1st Minnesota Regiment reported and trained at Fort Snelling in preparation for war, initially for a 3-month tour, and then later for a 3-year contract. These rugged men of the frontier would travel from the western fringes of the country to the Army of the Potomac, and in time into the annals of history. Campaign streamers were earned from famous battlefields such as Bull Run, where they would suffer a 20% casualty rate and earn great respect for holding their position in an open field under withering fire. Antietam, Fredericksburg, where their division commander would note to the regimental commander of that time, Colonel Alfred Sully, "Your 1st Minnesota doesn't run," and Gettysburg, as we remember this evening. These were hard men, rough men of the West. They were skilled with the rifle, they carried chisel muscle from clearing and working the land, and were very familiar with the hardships that living on the frontier brought. All were natives of other states or immigrants who had traveled and settled in Minnesota, and all would bring great honor to our state for their service. Lieutenant Colonel Simon Schaefer will shortly present the report from Plum Run, so I won't go into the whole story now. But 2 things have always captured my attention since I first became aware of the remarkable story of the 1st Minnesota in Gettysburg. At the end of July 1863, having attacked and checked a force many times its size, and having suffered horrific casualties, not one soldier was missing. All remained accounted for, meaning not one man turned and fled the battlefield, even when death seemed so apparent and so close. The second point is that at the end of the day of July 1863, despite the horrific casualty rate, the 1st Minnesota was not removed from the battlefield. Instead, they stood fast, fought, and played a pivotal role in defeating Pickett's charge the next day, the final day of the battle in Gettysburg. Their contribution to our country on 2 July and 3 July 1863 near Plum Run, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, is summed up in the 1928 program printed on the occasion of the dedication of this very monument. The program read, "The heroic charge of the already decimated regiment is credited with saving the Union Army from defeat and thus making possible a Union victory on the following day. In the final analysis, Colonel Colvill, perhaps, saved not only the Union Army and the day at Gettysburg, but turned back the high tide of the Confederacy and saved the Union." Today we stand at Colonel William Colvill's monument and pay tribute to the men of this brave regiment, and we thank them for their service. We thank them for their sacrifice, but more importantly, we thank them for their example. An example that would live on and inspire future generations of Minnesota soldiers. For example, the World War II soldiers of the 34th Red Bull Infantry Division. These soldiers would not only be the first U.S. division to arrive in Europe, they would ultimately serve in more days of combat than any other U.S. division in the war. Our 1st Brigade, 34th Infantry Division. They mobilized, deployed, and fought in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom for 22 months, the longest deployment of any U.S. Army unit in support of OIF in the global war on terrorism. And 2nd Battalion, 135th Infantry, who over the last 10 years deployed to Kosovo twice, Afghanistan, Iraq twice, and Kuwait. The service, sacrifice, and legacy of the 1st Minnesota remains alive and well in your Minnesota Army National Guard today. Colonel Colville's promise of "to the last man" remains the regimental motto and greeting for soldiers and officers of 2nd Battalion, 135th Infantry. These words remind us of the sacrifice that came before us, the sacrifice expected of us, and the legacy we will provide to future generations of Minnesota soldiers. So as Lieutenant Colonel Schaefer prepares to present a reading of Plum Rum, I have a short poem I'd like to read. I'll leave you with the final stanza of this poem. The title of the poem is Gettysburg, Charge of the 1st Minnesota. The poem was written on the occasion of the June 1884 gathering of the Grand Army of the Republic here in Minnesota. The author of the poem, Hanford Lennox Gordon, was a veteran of Company D, 1st Minnesota Regiment. He wrote, "Tears for our fallen comrades cover their graves with flowers, for they fought and fell. They fought and fell like Spartans for this glorious land of ours. They fell, but they fell victorious, for the rebel ranks were riven, and over our land united, one nation from sea to sea. Over the grave of treason, over millions of men made free. Triumph, the flag of our fathers waves in the winds of heaven. Striped with the blood of her heroes, she waves in the winds of heaven. Tears for our fallen comrades cover their graves with flowers, for they fought and fell like Spartans for this glorious land of ours. And oft shall our children's children garland their graves and say, they bore the banner of freedom on Gettysburg's hills that day." Again, thank you for coming out this evening and remembering these men and their actions 150 years ago. To the last man.
Thank you, Colonel Jensen. Before we lay the ceremonial wreath on this 150th anniversary of the 1st Minnesota heroic charge at Gettysburg, I will read a portion of the regimental history from July 2nd, 1863. General Hancock was riding from unit to unit, patching up the lines which were under constant Confederate pressure, and he had called for additional reserves. Reserves were coming to the threatened sector on the double when the Union right flank began to give way. 2 fresh Confederate brigades, attacking an echelon left, came storming through the broken Federal line. The lead unit was General Wilcox's Alabama Brigade, followed by General Barksdale's Mississippi Rifle Brigade. General Hancock saw the danger, not only to the Union flank, but to the entire Federal Army, and he knew he needed just a few minutes until the reserves he had called for would arrive. The nearest available unit to stop the Confederate penetration was the 1st Minnesota, with 262 men present for duty. Hancock rode to Colonel Colvill and ordered Colvill to countercharge the Confederates. When Hancock asked Colvill if his regiment could hold the attacking Confederate brigades, Colvill's response was, "To the last man." This was the desperate bayonet attack which was to earn the 1st Minnesota its enduring fame and reputation. Colvill formed his line and called on the regiment to fix bayonets. The men knew their chances for survival were slim. The attack was to be alone and totally unsupported. It was the 1st Minnesota, greatly reduced in numbers, against 2 veteran Confederate brigades. The regiment was outnumbered 10-1. Colvill and his men realized their only chance was to charge the enemy on the dead run with leveled bayonets and to get in and among the Confederates so they could fight hand to hand until reinforcements arrived. The ground over which the counterattack was to take place sloped forward and down to a section of dry creek bed near the Trossel House, and then slightly inclined in the direction of the Emmitsburg Road. The 1st Minnesota Regiment's lines were drawn. The men were ready. They could see Wilcox's brigade coming down the slope past the Trossel House. Colvill sounded the charge. The regiment surged forward over the exposed distance of about 150 yards. The Confederates immediately opened fire, taking a terrible toll on the regiment, but the 1st Minnesota came in rank after rank, with men falling to the murderous Confederate musket fire until their bayonets struck home among the front ranks of the Alabama Brigade. The savage attack caused Wilcox's men to turn and stumble back into Barksdale's brigade. The ensuing confusion in the Confederate ranks provided just enough time for Hancock's reserve to arrive and charge past the dead and dying Minnesota troops, driving the disorganized Confederates back through the wheat field. Colonel Colvill was critically wounded, and it would be months before he could walk. Of the 262 men who made the historic charge, 215 lay dead or wounded. The regiment was virtually destroyed, suffering 82% casualties in 5 terrible minutes. But, as Hancock later said, those 5 precious minutes were made possible by the gallant charge of the 1st Minnesota. I would have sent them in if I had known they would have all been killed. I was fortunate enough to have such a regiment close at hand. The ceremony you are about to witness is a military wreath-laying ceremony. The wreath will be placed by Colonel Jensen. The wreath is being laid on the gravesite of Colonel William Colvill, who served as the 1st Minnesota Regimental Commander on July 2nd, 1863. Would you please rise? Present. Arms. Order. Arms. This concludes the evening ceremony, and we thank you for attending this event in remembrance of those that gave their lives in service to our great country and to honor the lineage of the 1st Minnesota.